Welcome to Outlaw Bookseller with me, Stephen E. Andrews, writer, bookseller, collector, author of 100 must-read science fiction novels. In this video, we move into the intoxicated world of Northwest Smith and his paramour, Shambleau. Northwest Smith, tall, star-tanned, scarred by blaster and talon, eyes like stainless steel, clad in frayed leather and spacer's boots. His stillness and cool demeanour belie a tendency for swift, decisive violence. A hard-drinking rogue and implacable adventurer, wanted on terror, but respected in every base dive of the solar system, a ray gun at his hip. Smith is an Earthman unable and unwilling to keep out of trouble. His life follows a pattern: another girl, another planet. On Mars, he rescues the lovely crimson-turbaned, coffee-hued Shambleau from a mob, only to discover that her feline eyes and scarlet tresses offer a horrible yet voluptuous pleasure few men could resist. Another evening on Venus, Smith is lured into the forbidden house of the finest courtesans of the system by the stunning Vaudia, whose creamy flesh spills wantonly from her green velvet gown. Smith is tormented by the black thirst for her, for the immaculate beauty selectively bred by the Alindar, an extrasolar alien who takes humanoid form. Hunger jaded by these peerless doxies, the Alindar finds Smith himself the most toothsome morsel on the menu. Smith is an archetypal figure, the inspiration for every two-fisted existentialist in the history of space opera, from sophisticated spacefarers like M. John Harrison's John Truck of the Centauri device, to the cartoon heroics of Han Solo of Star Wars. In a prose that is both brazenly lurid and carefully affected, Moore brought the one-dimensional icons of earlier space operas to vivid life, with bold strokes of colourful, enticing eroticism. Her manner of combining shimmering lust, vibrant fantasy imagery, and flashes of horror set in classic SF context ensures that her stature as an icon of popular fiction will never fade. Working on her own, and in collaboration with her husband Henry Kutner, she was the greatest of the early female SF writers. What if Shambleau were real? Would I be taken with her? Most certainly. Like the vision of seductive Eden that Paul Gauguin painted when he went to Tahiti in search of the sublime. Sensuality, texture, existential angst, the sense that all is lost pervade Smith's existence. He is so often dazed and ravaged by these sensual encounters, but he seems unwilling and unable to resist them. In one sense, Northwest is that classic thing, a submissive who only wants to submit on his own terms, but is subconsciously drawn to losing control, only to step back from the brink at the last moment. Moore uses all her feminine wiles as a writer and all her understanding of men to ensure that the reader feels an appropriately adult and realistic spectrum of emotions through the lens of Northwest Smith when he becomes enamoured of Shambleau. Adept at employing a myriad of hues, consummate with sensation, Moore evokes sympathy for Shambleau. Smith's disgust is meshed with an irresistible desire for the incarnadine tress Medusa, the gleaming coils of her serpentine hair enslaving him into that willing addiction. And it's no surprise that William S. Burroughs incorporated sections of Fury, which Kutner and Moore wrote together, even though credited to Kutner, into his Nova trilogy, Smith and others who fall under the glamour of Shambleau are willing, dependent slaves for the rest of their lives, which are short, those early demises, and they luxuriate in their addiction to the entrancing, apparently woman-like Shambleau, who of course is nothing of the kind. This is an alien being. Burroughs, of course, was no stranger to addiction himself, his writings riven with his accounts of his experiences with heroin that lasted for years and years and years. This unconcealed admission of addiction as a subject links Moore and the whole weird fiction tradition to the decadence of Romanticism and its successive movements. It reminds me of Coleridge's laudanum visions in Kubla Khan, laudanum of course being a tincture of opium and alcohol, and Shambleau's green cat eyes are reminiscent of absinthe, the drink which enslaved many in late 19th century Paris and which remained banned outside France for many, many years until recently. But of course this is pure pulp SF, showing the influence of Edgar Rice Burroughs' visions of Mars, themselves reflecting the decadence and symbolists in their milieu. Northwest of Earth went through numerous incarnations under different titles, largely incomplete, being entitled Shambleau, Shambleau and Others, Scarlet Dreams, then in 2007 finally assembled Northwest of Earth, aka the complete Northwest Smith. Finally, for the first time, all the stories came together. There were collaborations, one with Forry Ackerman. Then, of course, the most important one was Quest of the Starstone, which featured Kutner and Moore in collaboration for the first time. This was in Weird Tales in November 1937. They married in 1940. They used numerous pseudonyms, most notably Lewis Paget, Lawrence O'Donnell, and probably, I think the count is 17 to 30 others, including house names. My first reading of Shambleau was in an old paperback I no longer have, simply entitled Shambleau, and it only contained a few of the Northwest Smith tales, and that was her first and her most famous. She was a typist in a bank in 1933 when she submitted the story to Weird Tales. I think it was in November 33 it was published, and she was instantly the doyenne of that fabled magazine. I then managed to pick up this, Black Gods and Scarlet Dreams, a beautiful edition, probably the most beautiful edition there's been of the Smith stories, and also the Jirel of Jawiri stories, which we'll be talking about in another video coming up soon. And they're the classical invocation of the Gorgon Medusa. And this is no longer available, sadly. Absolutely beautiful, but it does not contain the complete Northwest Smith stories. Some years later, I think it was around about 2007, this was issued in the wonderful Planet Stories imprint, no longer with us. A classic collection of planetary romances was the complete Northwest of Earth, with an introduction by C.J. Cherryh. I don't particularly like this depiction of Smith or Shambleau. I don't think it's very satisfying, but this is the real thing. All the stories are in there. And since then, the later edition, the Gollancz Golden Age Masterwork, and of course, most of these stories precede the Golden Age by some years, actually contains them all, even though it's a bit slight on pagination in terms of a contents page. More recently, I acquired this A-format Ace edition with the wonderful artwork by Jim Burns. Even though I love Jim's art, I'm not particularly that fond of this depiction of Shambleau, even though it's relatively accurate. I see her as slightly more humanoid than this. She has a very pointy alien face, and she is supposed to be cat-like, and I can see what he's aiming for, but she doesn't quite do it for me there. She has to be humanoid enough to be physically attractive, and in this case I'm not so certain that is the way things turned out, but still a fantastic bit of cover art nonetheless. In another video that will be coming up soon on the channel, we'll have a look at Jirel of Jawiri, the first female sword and sorcery heroine, and her exploits are now available complete and in the correct order in this Gollancz Golden Age Masterworks, though they were most of them in here. And Black Gods was often the title of the Jirel stories under different covers, and Scarlet Dreams or Scarlet Dream was the title of the Shambleau Northwest Smith stories. Also now widely available is Doomsday Morning from the late 50s, which is less typical of Moore's work and less successful, but still a really good read, and showed that she could still do it beyond the Golden Age, beyond her pulp origins. And it was around about this time she started to write for television. Kutner and Moore collaborated from 1940 onwards. There is some belief that everything they wrote from then on was a collaboration. It's difficult to tell, of course. They had quite different styles in some ways. Moore was rich, sensual, verbose. Kutner was more witty, more about structure and plot. So the theory is that most of the stories attributed to Lewis Paget, and this is a classic collection in Bantam of the Lewis Paget stories, which were really popular in the 1940s, and they tend to be the witty, more knockabout ones about toys and childish kind of things. They were really, really popular. The theory is that they are mostly Kutner. Another primary pseudonym the pair used was Lawrence O'Donnell, and that later inspired Barry N. Malzberg's initial pseudonym, which was K.M. O'Donnell. And here are two of Malzberg's books as K.M. O'Donnell, early ones, The Empty People and Universe Day. And of course the K is for Kutner, the M is for Moore, and the O'Donnell is another homage to the pair. There does seem to be strong evidence that the O'Donnell stories are mostly by Moore alone, but this is disputed and nobody can really tell. If you look at the Keeps sequence, which begins with Clash by Night, as you see in this UK Hamlin edition, entirely attributed to Kutner on the cover, and yet on the rear it mentions Moore and also in the introduction. The theory is, even though it's long been attributed to him, that it's actually written by Moore, and Clash by Night is a prequel to the most famous Kutner book, which is Fury, which is the one quoted by William Burroughs and credited within the text of the Burroughs novels. So it's quite interesting because I, for a long time, have talked about my love of Kutner, and I think all along it's really been my love of Moore. Even though they've always been reprinted as being by Henry Kutner and no mention of Moore on the front of the jackets, Moore did sign copies of Fury, and there is that feeling, because of the sensuality and the colour and the prose, that they really sort of must largely be by her. There's a different feeling when you come to Kutner's next famous work, Mutant, which does owe a certain debt to A. Van Vogt Slan, and you'll notice here that the character on the cover has no hair. These were called the Baldy stories, which wasn't very flattering, and of course that's where Professor X of the X-Men comes from. So you see this whole thread throughout Golden Age SF about psi powers, starting with Slan, being developed by John W. Campbell, who became obsessed with the idea of psi powers. There was a certain point in understanding where he wouldn't publish stories unless they had psi powers, feeding through into this. And this is quite different to the feel of Clash by Night and Fury, and doesn't seem to have so much more in it to my way of thinking. There were some fully credited collaborations, like Earth's Last Citadel, which isn't too difficult to find, where both Moore and Kutner are on the cover together, double billed. Other classics from the period, like Chessboard Planet, seems to have some more input, whereas The Proud Robot, also published as Robots Have No Tails, is generally believed to be the key inspiration for Marvin the Paranoid Android in Douglas Adams' novels in the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy sequence. And because these are more humorously based, that is less of Moore's thing. She tends to be darker and shadowyer and bloodier and more sensual. It seems likely that this is the most Kutner-esque of the Kutner books out there, alongside Mutant. This is a Red Jacket Press facsimile reissue of the original Gnome Press edition of Judgment Night by C.L. Moore, which is 5 SF stories. And I must have bought this about 20 years ago. Very beautiful. It's a very tight slip case, but it perfectly reproduces what the Gnome original would have looked like. And there's a list there of the books which were in Gnome at that time, which is late 40s, early 50s, and absolutely fantastic stuff. I'll just pop it out of the case for you to see. So here's the book itself with a fantastic lurid jacket, and there's a little card inside that tells you all about C.L. Moore and the book. And lovely, really, really nice. I don't think you can get these anymore. I'm not sure what else they did in this series. I should have a look, actually. But this also relies a lot on an exploration of sex and sensuality to put its SF ideas across. And I'll be talking about Judgment Night in more depth later on in the future of the channel. Moore and Kutner enjoyed a long and fruitful collaboration throughout the 1940s, and they both went to the University of California to study from 1950 onwards, and she graduated in 1956, then turned to television writing until 1963, when she retired from SF, and she died in 1987. During the 1950s, she and Kutner worked a lot on crime fiction, most of which has not survived to be reprinted that much and is highly collectible now. And it's strange, I'm not sure why they abandoned SF, because it seemed to me that stylistically they would have really come through in the 1950s, but obviously they had different concerns. In 1958, Kutner died at the age of 44 of a heart attack, seen as one of the great tragedies of the post-golden age of genre SF. Round about the same time as C.M. Cornbluth died, and he was even younger. I think Cornbluth was only about 35. And, this was a double blow to genre SF at that time. This is a signed edition of Scarlet Dream, and on the cover here you can see Northwest Smith and Shambleau, a rather different depiction, and I've had this for many years, and this didn't come signed originally. It's been signed and dedicated by Moore to somebody called Robert, and yeah, I think this is the trade edition. There was a limited edition which was pre-signed with some lovely artwork in there, so take a look at that. Really, really nice stuff. And I see him as a little too smooth, really, to be Northwest, and I see Shambleau there as not really sort of being exotic enough, but it is beautiful stuff, and I'm glad to have this. I'd love to have met C.L. Moore. Obviously, she's been gone for a long time. I will say a brief word here about the final Northwest Smith story, Song in a Minor Key, which is one of my favourite short stories of all time. And it's literally about 2.5 pages long, if that long, and it reveals Smith's origin story. He's back on Earth, relaxing in a grassy field, thinking about the past, and then the past comes back, and we get hints and flashes of a life born in fire, of a man changed in his youth, of somebody who could not take no for an answer. And it's a beautiful, beautiful story. And the terse, abrupt ending, which cuts the story off and cuts the sequence off, leaves us in no doubt of what kind of man Smith is. Anti-heroic and yet entirely relatable, but at the same time an archetype, but nonetheless a full-blown character, not merely a sketchy outline. There is, of course, more to say about C.L. Moore and her science fiction. The problem is managing to obtain it in one cover, because stories are split across anthologies and what have you, and it is time for a new definitive collection. The closest you can get to the best is the best of C.L. Moore, published in that Best Of series many decades ago by Ballantine Del Rey, which are virtually impossible to find, especially in the UK. And I've been looking for one for a while, and I do have one earmarked with a dealer, and I'm just hoping that he comes back online soon so I can snap it up. But other stories to look at are Vintage Season. Vintage Season is an amazing story. It was filmed in the early 90s for a cable TV company in the States, not very faithfully, even though the film itself went down well. And Vintage Season is a wonderful time travel story, and it has all the coldness and sensuality of Moore's best work. It really is something special, and I do want to talk about it again on the channel, but in a different context. Another great story is the cyborg tale, No Woman Born, another classic, which again I'm going to talk about in a different context. In the meantime, if you can get yourself northwest of Earth and read the Northwest Smith stories, you'll be off to a flying start. And soon we'll talk about Jirel of Jewelry, and also about Henry Kutner and his works in more depth. Thanks for watching. This is Outlaw Bookseller. Please like, subscribe, comment, super thanks if you want to support the channel, that stuff, and let yourself fall into a scarlet dream.